The late afternoon sun bathed the small suburban park in a warm golden glow. Birds chirped softly, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze filled the air. In the middle of the park, Marcus, a lively 12-year-old black boy, grinned as he ran across the grass with his homemade kite trailing behind him. The kite wasn't perfect, crafted from newspaper and twine, but it soared just enough to make him feel triumphant. This park was Marcus's escape, a brief refuge from the challenges he faced in a world that often felt too heavy for a boy his age. A few yards away, two police officers, Jack Harlow and Timothy Grant, leaned lazily against their patrol car, sipping coffee and exchanging crude jokes. Both were middle-aged white men who had been with the department for over a decade. Their badges gave them a sense of authority they wielded with casual cruelty, especially when it came to minorities in the community. Known for their arrogance and disdain toward people of color, they had faced whispers of misconduct but always managed to avoid serious repercussions. Jack's eyes scanned the park, landing on Marcus. He nudged Timothy with his elbow. "Look at that kid," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Playing all by himself. What do you think he's up to?" Timothy chuckled, taking a long sip of his coffee. "Probably looking for trouble. You know how these kids are." Their boredom quickly morphed into a sinister sense of amusement. Jack set his cup down and adjusted his belt, a wicked glint in his eye. "Let's teach him a lesson," he said. "You know, for fun." The officers approached Marcus, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel. The boy, noticing their looming presence, stopped running and clutched his kite tightly. His heart raced, unsure why they were coming toward him. "What are you doing here, kid?" Jack barked, his tone accusatory. Marcus looked up at the officers, his wide eyes filled with a mix of confusion and fear. "Just playing with my kite," he said quietly. Jack snatched the kite from his hands and examined it mockingly. "This piece of junk? Doesn't look like much fun to me." Timothy laughed, the sound cold and devoid of humor. "How about we show you some real fun?" Marcus's grip on the kite string tightened, but before he could react, Jack grabbed him roughly by the arm. "Come on, boy," Jack sneered. "Let's see if you're brave enough to climb a tree." Fear surged through Marcus as the officers dragged him toward a large oak tree. His pleas went unanswered, their laughter chillingly devoid of humanity. In their minds, this was nothing more than a game. But for Marcus, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The massive oak tree stood at the edge of the park, its gnarled branches reaching out like twisted arms. Marcus struggled against the tight grip of the two officers dragging him toward it, but his small frame was no match for their strength. His cries for help echoed through the empty park, but no one was around to hear him. "Let me go. I didn't do anything," Marcus pleaded, his voice trembling with fear. Jack laughed darkly, ignoring the boy's protests. "Didn't do anything, huh? Well, we'll see about that." Timothy chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Relax, kid. We're just having a little fun. You like games, don't you?" Marcus's heart raced as he was forced to the base of the tree. Jack shoved him against the rough bark, his smirk widening as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Without a word, he locked Marcus's wrists behind his back, the cold steel biting into the boy's skin. "This one's for the history books," Jack said, snickering as he stepped back to admire his handiwork. "Bet you never thought you'd be part of a good old-fashioned hanging." Timothy walked back to the patrol car and rummaged through the trunk, returning with a length of thin wire. He tossed it to Jack, who caught it with a flourish. "Perfect," Jack said, straightening the wire between his hands. "Now, this is going to be a real lesson in humility." Marcus thrashed against the cuffs, tears streaming down his face. "Please, let me go. I just want to go home." But his desperation only seemed to amuse the men further. "Home," Timothy mocked, leaning in close. "Home is wherever we say it is, boy." With practiced precision, Jack looped the wire around Marcus's neck. The boy flinched as the sharp metal pressed against his skin. Jack tugged it tight enough to make Marcus gasp, his small body trembling under the weight of his terror. "Hold still, kid," Jack said with mock patience. "You're ruining the fun." Timothy began climbing onto a low branch, tying the other end of the wire to it. The two men hoisted Marcus up, his feet barely leaving the ground. Marcus's cries turned into choking gasps as the wire tightened around his neck. His eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "Now that's a picture," Timothy said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "Look at him squirm. Reminds me of the good old days." Jack folded his arms, a smirk plastered across his face. "There's something satisfying about this, you know? Like justice, but funnier." Marcus's vision blurred as his breath came in shallow gasps. His body strained against the wire, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw air. The world around him seemed to close in, his cries for help reduced to faint, choking sounds. But even in his panic, Marcus's instincts kicked in. With what little strength he had, he twisted his body just enough to nudge the phone in his pocket. His trembling fingers managed to press a button on the side, activating his emergency speed dial. The faint beeping sound of the call going through was drowned out by the officer's laughter. On the other end of the line, Commander Nathaniel Walker was driving home from another long day at the precinct. The sudden ring of his phone startled him, and when he saw Marcus's name flashing on the screen, he answered immediately. "Marcus? Everything okay?" Nathaniel asked, his voice tinged with concern. For a brief moment, he heard his son's gasping cries, the word help barely audible before the line went dead. Nathaniel's heart sank, dread washing over him like a wave. Without hesitation, he activated the GPS tracking on Marcus's phone, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as he sped toward the park. Back at the oak tree, Jack and Timothy continued their cruel game. Timothy casually leaned against the trunk, his laughter echoing in the silence. "You think he's learned his lesson yet?" Jack shrugged, clearly enjoying the sight of Marcus's struggle. "Nah, let him hang a little longer. Kids like him need to understand their place." The two men were so absorbed in their twisted spectacle that they didn't hear the roar of an approaching engine. Nathaniel's black SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of the park, gravel flying as he jumped out of the vehicle. His sharp eyes scanned the area, and when he spotted his son hanging from the tree, his world seemed to stop. "Marcus!" Nathaniel shouted, his voice filled with panic and fury. Jack and Timothy turned, their laughter dying instantly as they recognized the tall, imposing figure storming toward them. They had no idea who he was, but the fire in his eyes was enough to make them take a step back. Nathaniel reached the tree in seconds, his hands trembling as he worked to free Marcus. He cradled his son's limp body in his arms, checking his pulse and breathing. Marcus coughed weakly, his eyes fluttering open. Relief flooded Nathaniel as he held his son close. Marcus's world had narrowed to the cruel wire biting into his neck and the laughter of the two men who saw his suffering as entertainment. His small body twisted and writhed, searching for relief, but every movement seemed to tighten the grip of the makeshift noose. His vision blurred with tears, and he could feel his strength fading. "Please," he gasped, his voice hoarse and weak. "Stop. Let me go." Jack and Timothy stood a few feet away, watching with twisted amusement. Jack leaned against the tree, a smug grin on his face as he casually picked at his nails. "Look at him go. Like a fish on a hook." "Yeah," Timothy said with a chuckle. "It's almost like he's trying to fly. Isn't that what you were doing, kid? Flying your little kite?" Marcus's mind raced. He felt the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists and the unrelenting wire digging into his neck. The pain was unbearable, but fear surged through him more powerfully. Somewhere in the depths of his panic, he remembered the phone in his pocket. It was his lifeline, the device his father had always insisted he carry in case of emergencies. Summoning every ounce of strength, Marcus wriggled his body, angling his hip toward his pocket. His fingers, cuffed behind him, stretched desperately, searching for the familiar shape of the phone. His wrist strained, and for a moment, he thought he wouldn't reach it. Then, the tip of his finger brushed against the smooth edge. The officers were too busy congratulating themselves on their game to notice Marcus's subtle movements. They were laughing now, trading crude jokes and reliving their imagined good old days. Marcus pressed a button on the phone, activating his emergency speed dial. It was a feature his father had set up for him. Just one press, and it would call Nathaniel directly. The phone slipped from his pocket and hit the ground, but the call was already in motion. Far away, Commander Nathaniel Walker was on his drive home when his phone buzzed. Seeing Marcus's name on the caller ID brought a smile to his face. He answered cheerfully, "Hey, buddy, what's up?" But instead of his son's familiar voice, there was only garbled noise. A faint sound of choked gasps, a single, desperate word, "Help," then silence. "Marcus." Nathaniel's voice was sharp now, filled with concern. "Marcus, are you there?" No response. Panic gripped Nathaniel as he pulled over to the side of the road. He activated the phone's GPS tracker, watching as the location blinked on his screen. It was the park near their home. Nathaniel's heart pounded as he sped toward the location, gripping the wheel tightly, dread coursing through him. Back at the park, Marcus's strength was waning. The laughter of Jack and Timothy grew distant as his vision darkened. But even as he hovered on the edge of unconsciousness, he clung to one hope, that his father would find him in time. The sound of gravel crunching under tires filled the quiet park as Nathaniel Walker's black SUV screeched to a halt. He had been driving at breakneck speed, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. He leaped out of the car, his sharp eyes scanning the area, his heart hammering in his chest. Then he saw it, a scene that froze him in his tracks. His son, Marcus, hung limply from the low branch of an old oak tree, a wire looped tightly around his neck. Two officers stood a few feet away, their backs to him, laughing and exchanging casual remarks as if it were just another day on the job. "Marcus!" Nathaniel roared, his deep voice filled with panic and fury. The officers turned at the sound of the shout, their smirks faltering when they saw the tall, broad-shouldered man striding toward them. His sharp suit and commanding presence screamed authority, but it was the blazing anger in his eyes that sent a chill down their spines. For a moment, they froze, unsure how to react. Nathaniel rushed to Marcus, his hands trembling as he worked to untie the wire from his son's neck. The boy's small body sagged into his father's arms, gasping weakly for air. Nathaniel held him tightly, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I've got you, son. I've got you." Marcus coughed and blinked up at his father, tears streaming down his face. "Dad," he croaked. "I'm here, Marcus." "You're safe now," Nathaniel said, his voice trembling with emotion. He gently set Marcus on the ground, ensuring he could breathe properly, then turned his full attention to the two officers. Jack and Timothy exchanged uneasy glances. They had been too absorbed in their cruelty to recognize Nathaniel earlier, but now the realization hit them like a freight train. This was no ordinary civilian. This was their new boss, Commander Nathaniel Walker, the recently appointed chief of police. "What the hell is going on here?" Nathaniel demanded, his voice low and dangerous. His imposing frame loomed over the two men, and his piercing gaze made it clear that no excuse would be acceptable. Jack tried to stammer out an explanation. "Sir, we were just, it was a joke. We didn't mean any harm." Nathaniel's fury exploded. "A joke? You call hanging a child by the neck a joke? You're supposed to protect this community, not terrorize it." He stepped closer, his voice rising. "Do you even understand what you've done? That's my son you strung up there like he's less than human. My son." Timothy took a step back, his confidence crumbling. "Sir, we didn't know. We didn't mean." "Save it," Nathaniel snapped. His voice was thunderous now, reverberating through the park. "You didn't know? You thought it didn't matter who he was? You thought it was fun to terrorize a child because of the color of his skin?" Jack and Timothy shrank under his gaze, their smug attitudes replaced with fear. They knew they had crossed a line, but it was too late to undo their actions. Nathaniel pulled out his phone, his hand shaking with a mix of anger and adrenaline. He called dispatch, his voice cold and precise. "This is Commander Walker. I need immediate backup at the park near Elm Street. Two officers, Harlow and Grant, are under arrest for assault, child endangerment, and misconduct." Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't arrest us. We're cops." Nathaniel's expression was unyielding. "No one is above the law. Not even you." Within minutes, squad cars arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkening sky. Nathaniel stood firm, watching as the two officers were cuffed and led away by their colleagues. Jack and Timothy protested loudly, but the weight of their crime, and the knowledge of who they had targeted, silenced them. As the officers were driven away, Nathaniel knelt by Marcus, holding him close. "You're safe now, Marcus. They'll never hurt you again." "Dad," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. "They said it was a joke." "It didn't feel like one." Nathaniel hugged him tighter, his voice soft but resolute. "It wasn't a joke, son. It was evil. But I promise you this. They will pay for what they've done." With Marcus safe in his arms and justice already in motion, Nathaniel knew the battle ahead would be long and grueling. But for his son, and for every child who had suffered under such cruelty, he was prepared to fight with everything he had. Nathaniel Walker stood in the quiet park, his towering presence radiating fury and authority. His son, Marcus, lay nearby, recovering from the nightmare he had just endured. The two officers, Jack Harlow and Timothy Grant, stood a few feet away, their smugness gone, replaced by growing fear. The realization of who Nathaniel was, their new boss, hung heavy in the air. Nathaniel advanced toward them, his voice a cold, sharp blade. "What gave you the right? What made you think you could hang a child for fun?" His eyes burned with righteous anger, his hands clenched into fists. "Do you think this badge protects you from accountability? Do you think it makes you untouchable?" Jack tried to regain his composure, stammering, "Commander Walker, sir, it was just a misunderstanding. A joke." "A joke?" Nathaniel thundered, cutting him off. "You call hanging a 12-year-old boy by the neck a joke? You think terrorizing a child is funny? That's not a joke. That's a crime." Timothy stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Sir, we didn't know he was your son. If we had—" Nathaniel's voice rose, laced with icy rage. "And if he wasn't my son, would it have been acceptable then? Would you have laughed and walked away while an innocent child suffered? Your behavior isn't just cruel, it's despicable. You disgrace the uniform you wear and everything it's supposed to stand for." The two men shrank under Nathaniel's glare, the weight of their actions bearing down on them. They exchanged panicked glances, searching for a way out, but there was none. Nathaniel was relentless. "You have no place in this department, or in this community," Nathaniel continued, his voice like thunder. "You've abused your power, and you've betrayed the trust of the people you were sworn to protect." Nathaniel pulled out his phone, dialing the precinct. His voice was calm, but the edge of fury remained. "This is Commander Walker. I need officers at the park near Elm Street immediately. 2 officers, Jack Harlow and Timothy Grant, are to be taken into custody. Charges include assault, false imprisonment, child endangerment, and abuse of power." Jack's face turned pale. "Sir, you can't do this. We're cops." Nathaniel fixed him with a steely gaze. "No one is above the law. Not even you." Minutes later, squad cars arrived. Officers stepped out, visibly uncomfortable as they realized their colleagues were the ones being arrested. Nathaniel made no apologies for his actions. He watched as Jack and Timothy were cuffed and led to the patrol cars, their protests falling on deaf ears. As the cars drove away, Nathaniel knelt beside Marcus, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "They won't hurt you, or anyone else, ever again," he said firmly. "Justice will be served." In that moment, Nathaniel vowed not just to protect his son, but to root out the systemic rot that allowed such cruelty to exist. His fight had just begun, but he was ready for the battle ahead. The news of the incident spread like wildfire through the community. Social media lit up with outrage as details emerged about how 2 police officers had strung up a 12-year-old black boy for fun. The fact that the victim was the son of Commander Nathaniel Walker, the newly appointed police chief, only amplified the shock and anger. The community, long simmering with frustration over unchecked police misconduct, erupted in protests. Outside City Hall and the police precinct, crowds gathered with signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Terror." Activists demanded immediate accountability, not just for the officers involved, but for the entire system that had allowed such cruelty to fester. Nathaniel, though still grappling with the trauma of the event, stepped forward to address the public. At a press conference, Nathaniel stood behind the podium, his voice steady but filled with emotion. What happened to my son was not an isolated incident. It was the result of a system that has allowed abuse of power to go unchecked for far too long. As your police chief and as a father, I promise to hold these officers accountable and to work tirelessly to ensure this never happens again. Not to my son, not to anyone. The crowd erupted in applause, their faith in Nathaniel growing with his resolve. News outlets carried the story nationally, further fueling the call for justice. The police department, under intense scrutiny, launched an internal investigation into past complaints of misconduct. Officers who had turned a blind eye to their colleagues' behavior now faced growing pressure to speak up. Nathaniel's response ignited hope in the community. For the first time in years, they saw a leader willing to confront corruption head-on, and they rallied behind him, ready to demand the change they had long been denied. The internal investigation into Jack Harlow and Timothy Grant's actions quickly expanded as more evidence of their misconduct surfaced. Complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and intimidation tactics emerged, painting a damning picture of their careers. Nathaniel Walker, determined to root out the systemic issues within the department, ordered a comprehensive review of all officers' records and behaviors. Jack and Timothy were formally charged with multiple crimes, including assault, false imprisonment, and child endangerment. Their trial became a focal point for the city, with activists, community members, and national media following every detail. Witnesses came forward, recounting years of abuse and mistreatment at the hands of the two officers, further solidifying the case against them. Nathaniel worked tirelessly to implement immediate reforms within the department. He introduced mandatory bias training, strengthened accountability measures, and established a civilian oversight board to investigate complaints independently. When Jack and Timothy were found guilty and sentenced to prison, it sent a powerful message. No one, not even law enforcement, was above the law. The verdict marked the beginning of a new chapter for the city, a chance to rebuild trust between the community and the police, driven by the courage and resilience of a father who refused to back down. In the weeks following the trial, the city began its journey toward healing. Marcus, still recovering from the trauma, attended therapy sessions with the unwavering support of his father. Nathaniel made time each day to remind his son of his strength and resilience, vowing to protect him and ensure no child in their community would ever endure such cruelty again. The oak tree in the park, once a symbol of terror, was transformed. The community rallied to install a plaque at its base, reading, "In honor of resilience and justice. May we never forget, and may we always strive for a better tomorrow." Nathaniel continued his mission to reform the police department. Under his leadership, new community programs flourished, focusing on trust building, transparency, and fairness. Residents began to feel a renewed sense of hope, seeing their voices reflected in the department's policies. As Marcus walked through the park with his father one sunny afternoon, he looked up at the tree and smiled faintly. "We changed it, didn't we?" he asked. Nathaniel placed a hand on his shoulder, nodding. "We did, and we'll keep changing things together." The city's scars remained, but they now carried the promise of a brighter, more just future.